Everyone, welcome to Time with the Bible Live. Glad that you're here. Encouraged that you've come, and hopefully you feel comfortable enough to be able to respond and to ask questions, anything that you might have. We've been going through the life of Jesus, talking about some of his interactions with people, some of his teachings, and today we're going to be looking at a prayer that he prayed just the day before he was crucified. And so we're going to be in Mark chapter 14. Mark 14. I'm taking this one solo today, and I think that's okay. We're going to have a couple others that are scheduled to come in the next couple weeks, so I'm looking forward to having people on. I like just sitting at the feet of people, listening to what other people have studied, and just giving some challenges to my own thoughts as I'm studying and trying to better understand some of these passages and better understand who Jesus was and some of his teachings. So we're going to be in Mark 14. We're going to talk about this prayer that Jesus has. Actually, it's a prayer that he prays 3 different times in the garden, right before he's arrested. I would think about the context of what's been going on. Back in Mark chapter 8, 9, and 10, Jesus 3 different times tells his apostles he's going to go to Jerusalem, and when they get there, he's going to suffer at the hands of the elders and the chief priests, and that he's going to die at the hands of the Gentiles, and that he's going to be resurrected 3 days later. And so you can kind of see in this period of time of his life, he needs his apostles to be ready, to be prepared. He needs them to know what's going to happen. So he's preparing them. But I think also as you go in Jesus's life, his whole life, I've heard before, Jesus's life is a Gethsemane. You know, there's a lot of stress in leading up to what he's going to endure when they arrived at Jerusalem. But really his whole life, because Jesus knew what his end was. Jesus knew what his life was leading up to. And here we are kind of on the cusp of all those events taking place. And he had just partook of the Lord's Supper, or just partook of the Passover with his disciples, where he established the Lord's Supper. And he established with them what was going to take place, that he was going to sacrifice his body, that his blood was going to be shed. And then he drops some bombshells. He tells them that all of them were going to forsake them that night. And they started asking, "Is it me, Lord? Is it me?" And Peter had a kind of a different response. Although he asked, "Is it me?" He says, "It's not me. It could be all of those guys, but it's not going to be me." And then he says, "Wait a minute, Peter. Tonight, you're going to deny even knowing me 3 times before the rooster crows twice." And Peter argues with him right there in verse 31, right before our passage. He says, "If I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said likewise. But Peter's arguing with Jesus right into this prayer. And so let's go ahead and read. We're in Mark 14:32. Mark 14:32. It says, "Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and began to be troubled and deeply distressed. And he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch.' And went a little further and fell on the ground, and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, 'Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will.' And then he came and found him sleeping, and said to Peter, 'Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' And again he went away, and he prayed and spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them sleeping again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And then he came the 3rd time and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.'" Okay, so they've partaken of the Passover. It's been Passover meal. It's been a late day. It is evening, which is the next day. And they head out of the city. They go to the garden that is also known as Gethsemane, which is really at the very foot of the Mount of Olives. And he instructs his disciples to stay put. And he goes further into the garden to pray. But in verse 33, he takes 3 of his disciples with him, Peter, James, and John. These are 3 of his closest friends, three of the closest disciples to him. You know, who would you want more to go be with you in a moment of distress like that than the people that were closest to you? And so he asked the 3 of them to go a little bit further. I just think about how Jesus was feeling in this moment, because he tells them to stay there and he goes further. You think about a moment where you were really stressed about something that was going to happen, something that was going to take place. Maybe you didn't even know that it was going to happen or not. Just think of a moment where the stress leading up to the moment was worse than the actual moment itself. Of course, that's not true with Jesus, but it affects your body. Like sometimes you can become weak. Sometimes you can make yourself sick. That's really how Jesus is feeling in this moment, this dread, this stress that's on his body. Like Jesus knows everything that's going to happen. He's known it his entire life. But he's just inching closer to that time that it was going to happen. He's becoming more and more stressed as the moment's feeling and as the moment's coming. And so how did he feel? Well, it says he began to be troubled and deeply distressed in verse 32. That's Mark's commentary on it. But how do we know if Mark is right or not? The only way whether we know Mark is right is the fact that Jesus says it himself. In fact, look how he says it. He says, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death." That's the stress. That's the dread. That's really stressed. Like Jesus is not exaggerating. He never exaggerates. He's not really, he hardly ever thinks about himself, but this is a really hard and difficult moment for Jesus, and he can barely bear it. He's nearly dying from the stress that is coming upon him. And what Jesus is about to do is really difficult. So what does he do in that moment? Well, he turns to the Father and he prays. That's something that we ought to do in our stressful moments and the difficult times that come in our life. We ought to turn to God and pray. Well, Jesus does that. In fact, Jesus often prayed, and he'd often pray in challenging moments or in big moments of his ministry. He would often be found on mountainsides praying alone, praying to the Father. I think we can learn a lot about Jesus's prayers and how our prayer life ought to really be challenged and molded by his dedication to prayer as well. And think about what he's praying here. He's praying that if this whole thing could be taken away from him, then that would be true. But we have this really powerful prayer because he says, "Not that's what I want. That's my will. But I don't want my will to be accomplished. I know that your will has to be accomplished here." So let's think about this prayer, kind of break down this prayer just a little bit. Think about some of the things that he says. First thing that he says is Abba, Father. Now that word Abba is really it is an enduring word for father. Some people translate this daddy, daddy. I don't think that's the point. I think it's just expressing love and adoration for his Father. And I don't know if he said it twice. I don't know if he just said Father or if he did say Abba, Father. It would have been Abba, Abba. Glad that you've joined us, Martin. Glad that you're here. Try to catch every comment that is being made. Watching from Kenya. Wow. Glad that you're on with us today. So I don't know if Mark is saying Abba to let us know what he actually said and then says Father, or if it's actually Abba, Abba, but he's expressing his love and his appreciation for the Father here. And then he says, all things are possible. Is that true with God? Is everything possible with God? I remember after he had corrected the rich young ruler, his apostles were just amazed that Jesus would turn away from turn this like men like this away. And he's talking about riches. And they say, well, who can be saved if this man can't be saved? A man who had kept all the commandments and everything. And he says, all things are possible with God. And all things are possible with God. God could take this moment away from him in an instant. In fact, what's amazing about all of this is that so could Jesus. Later on in Matthew 25, later on in the book, he says that he could call 10 legions of angels and they would come and take him away from this moment so Jesus had the ability to be able to stop this, but so did the Father. And he's pleading with the Father that if there's any way possible, he says, take this cup away from me. I think that's the same cup that we saw that you can see as you look back in Mark chapter 10, where Peter or James and John came to him and said, do whatever we ask of you. And he said, what do you want? They said, we want your right hand and your left hand. And Jesus says, well, that's not mine to give. Can you drink the cup that I'm drinking? And they said, yeah, we can drink that cup. And in a sense, they would drink a cup of pain and suffering for the sake of the gospel. But this cup was really a cup of God's wrath. This was a cup of Jesus bearing our sins in his body. And as you go through the Old Testament, you see like in Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of the other prophets, you see a picture of God's enemies drinking this venomous poison, this cup, and they would kind of keel over and die. And that's really the cup of God's wrath. He was going to bear in his body our sins and God's wrath, the punishment that we deserve. Not that he was guilty for our sins, not that he stood guilty before God, but he was going to be punished for them in the sense that he was going to be our sin offering. In the Old Testament, they would take a goat and they would put the sins of the people on the goat, and the goat would run into the wilderness. That was the scapegoat. That's what Jesus was going to be for us. He was going to take our sins in his body and become the guilt offering for us. And so, Matthew 15, this might show this in Matthew 15, verse 34, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, he'll say to him, my God, why have you forsaken him? Now, that might be an indication that God turned his back on Jesus in this moment. So what did that mean? What was that going to feel like? I don't know. I don't think we understand what that would be like, because although we live in a world in a sense that each of us have been separated from God, we still live in a world that's blessed by God's presence, that he sends the rain on the just and the unjust, that we still enjoy God's presence to some degree. I think what he's talking about is he was going to endure a sense of suffering that none of us know or understand or could even grasp. Maybe a torture that would only be described like a torture that would be in hell, where people were completely separated from the Father. And so I don't know. There's lots of people who have lost their life for God's will, like Stephen, James, and others. But I don't know how many of them seem stressed to the point of death. Jesus, I think he's taking on something that's even bigger than what anyone had taken on before. And then he asked that he would take this cup from him. I can't imagine being the father and hearing my son say something like that, because I have 4 boys. And if one of them was sick and suffering, and they said, Dad, can you take this sickness away from me? Like literally, if I could take the sickness away from them and be in their place, be in that hospital bed, in their place. I think a lot of parents would feel that way if they could literally take the place of their child. They would do that. But here you have a father who could take this away from his son. But for my sake and your sake and all of our sakes, he doesn't do that. He didn't do that. I can't imagine what that would have been like. Take this cup away from me, Father. And God, as much as he wanted to, understood that for our sakes, he couldn't do that. Then he says, not my will, but thine will be done. Perhaps one of the most amazing statements in all of the entire Bible. But Jesus had said things like that in other places. He would say, like, the words that I speak are not my own, but it's that which I've received from the Father. And he would constantly talk about doing the will of the Father. But here you have him stressed to the point of dying from the stress itself. And he says, take this cup, but not my will, but thine will. He submitted himself completely and totally to his Father's will. And yet he could have stopped it all. Jesus said he could have called 10 legions of angels. I tell you what, if they wanted to crucify me, they would have a pretty easy job of doing that. There's nothing that I could possibly do to have stopped them from crucifying me. But Jesus, in this whole period, could have stopped it in an instant. In a moment, he could have put all of it to an end. And yet, how remarkable is it that he never did that he completely allowed all of this to happen. He remained silent in times which he could have spoke up and he could have made an argument for himself where all of this could have stopped, but he didn't do that. He was like the lamb being led to the slaughter. John 10, verse 18, right after this in the arrest, Jesus says in John's account that he says, no one takes my life from me, but I lay my life down. No one takes it from me. Jesus completely submitted himself. This is a time, this would have been a time of deep temptation for Jesus. Every human fiber of him would have been kicking against this. He's grieved by it. He's distressed by it. He's begging God for mercy. And yet he says, not my will, but thine will be done. And while Jesus is deeply grieved, what's going on with the disciples here? Because he goes back out to them and they're asleep. They can't stay awake. They keep falling asleep. That doesn't seem very sympathetic to Jesus, does it? Jesus says, I'm deeply grieved. Can you please just stay awake for a time? I was thinking about this when I was preparing for this. What was wrong with them sleeping? I think number one, Jesus wanted them to be with him in his darkest moment. But I think number two, it was more about them than it was about him. Because look at the reasons he gives for them needing to stay awake. He says, lest you are led into temptation. Watch and pray. They were hurting themselves because they were not staying awake. And so they were putting themselves in this very vulnerable situation. They're not spiritually ready for what's coming. In a sense, it's a betrayal of Jesus, but in another sense, it's also it's putting themselves in a vulnerable and dangerous position. He says, watch. He says, I know that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. They have a desire, like they just argued with him and said, no, we would die with you if it means that. Their spirit was willing. But in the moment when the temptation hits, their flesh is weak. So he says, watch, be vigilant. Later on, Peter would say in 1 Peter 5, verse 8, he says, He says, be sober, be vigilant, for the adversary, the devil's prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Again, Peter would say that. Peter understood what that meant. Peter had a moment like that here where his flesh is just so weak that he wasn't as vigilant. He wasn't as watchful as he needed to be. That's especially true when you consider what will be later said in this chapter, down in 41 and 42, where he said that his betrayer was at hand. And so Judas comes with this entourage of soldiers with a multitude. I think other versions talk about it being a cohort. And you're talking about 300 or more soldiers coming to arrest Jesus. I was going to go into the arrest of Jesus. I think I will separate that out. We'll look at that later at a later point. But just kind of looking at this prayer, being challenged by some of the things that Jesus says in this prayer. And if anything we get out of it is that in moments of stress and moments of difficulty, Jesus does what we all should do. We all should turn to God and we all should pray. And we need to be vigilant and watchful, because sometimes our spirits are willing, but our flesh is really weak in those moments. And Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen. And instead of running, like a lot of us probably would too, Jesus goes out to his betrayer, kind of walks into the den of lions himself. Hopefully that was helpful, something just to think about and to be challenged by, something to kind of meditate on throughout the rest of your day. I appreciate you all being here. If you ever have any comments, any thoughts on this, please make sure that that you do that. If you only watched the end, didn't get to watch the beginning, you can always go back and watch the recording after this is put up. But man, I'm glad to be able to study with you, be able to open our Bibles together. Hope that you will read this passage for yourself and kind of give some more thought to it throughout the rest of your day. But everybody have a great day, and God bless.